Before we begin, there are a few logistics to cover. All participants are currently in listen-only mode. Please type any questions into the question box in the GoToMeeting app, and we will address them at the end of the webinar. We are recording the webinar today. However, we will not record the Q&A portion to encourage open and honest dialogue. I would like to provide a bit of background on the two presenters, Patricia Jurwitz and Liz Muller. Patricia is the founder and vice president of Responsible Sourcing Network, or RSN, a program of the nonprofit organization As You Sow. RSN is the creator of and houses all of the YES documents. Patricia has been educating investors and corporate communities on the intersection of modern slavery, human rights benchmarking, and supply chains for the past 15 years. She participates in working groups for Sustainable Apparel Coalition, Social and Labor Convergence Project, Cotton Campaign, Know the Chain, the ICCR Human Trafficking Group. To develop the YES initiative, Patricia is leveraging her contributions to the development of Fair Trade USA's Apparel and Home Goods Standard and Assurance Programs, or process for Responsible Minerals Initiative, or RMI, formerly called the Conflict-Free Smelters Program. Liz Muller, our second presenter, is assisting RSN with development of the YES standard, training, and tools. Liz has deep expertise developing systems that can be integrated into complex commodity supply chains. On behalf of Gap Inc., she acted as first chairperson of Better Cotton Initiative, or BCI. As a consultant, Liz helped BCI design the Better Cotton supply chain system to support production of and demand for better cotton. The BCI supply chain system design works within existing conventional supply chain networks and processes, thus enabling its efficient expansion. She has advised cotton merchants and supported Cotton Council International by facilitating discussions on governance issues facing the cotton industry. Liz also has experience developing and applying the due diligence framework for responsible commodity supply chains by developing the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development based in Paris. For RMI, Liz led one of 3 original global firms that conducted audits of smelters and now trains auditors and helps smelters prepare for audits. She is also a member of RMI's Standard Advisory Committee. With that, I will turn it over to Patricia.
Thank you, Maren, for the introduction. During today's webinar, I will introduce YES and explain what inspired us to create a due diligence standard for the cotton industry. Next, Liz will provide an in-depth explanation of the OECD due diligence guidance and how we are applying it to cotton yarn spinners through the YES initiative. I will then review our recent activities, including a summary of our feasibility assessment trip to Bangladesh, Turkey, and Uzbekistan this past fall. Next, I will go over proposed future activities we would like to complete over the next 3 years. I will make a request to become a founding partner to review how your organization can get involved and support the development and rollout of YES. We are planning on leaving 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. However, if your question does not get answered during the webinar, we are happy to follow up afterward. So, what is the problem and what is the industry-wide approach to the problem we are proposing with YES, Yarn Ethically and Sustainably Sourced? Today, nearly 25 million people are trapped around the world as forced laborers, including at least 1 million adults and children forced to work in the cotton sector. Just to be clear with the types of exploitation I am talking about, the ILO's Convention 29 defines forced labor as all work or service which is exacted from any person under the threat of penalty and for which the person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. It refers to situations in which persons are coerced to work through the use of violence or intimidation or by more subtle means such as manipulated debt, retention of identity papers, or threats of denunciation to authorities. RSN staff research the countries that have incidences of forced labor in their cotton sectors. Using the ILO's conventions and adequate evidence from numerous sources, we determined there are 9 countries that have a high risk of forced labor in their cotton production. We refer to these as high-risk countries under YES. The 9 high-risk countries are Benin, Burkina Faso, China, India, Kazakhstan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. The countries in the low-risk category have no or insufficient evidence of forced labor in their cotton sectors. This category includes all cotton-producing countries other than the 9 countries listed in the high-risk category. Due to the government-orchestrated forced labor in Uzbekistan's cotton sector, in 2015, RSN surveyed 49 brands and retailers to learn what they were doing to address this problem. Results showed that nearly 80% did not audit the spinning mills in their supply chains. The YES standard is a specific, practical framework to address the systems and practices that spinning mills implement to avoid sourcing cotton that may have been produced with forced labor. The YES standard has been created to align with the approach of the OECD Due Diligence Guidance for Responsible Supply Chains in the Garment and Footwear sector, with a focus on forced labor in cotton production. The OECD Guidance for Garment and Footwear was launched in February 2017. It follows other guidance documents issued by the OECD focused on agriculture, extractives, the financial sector, and others. The guidance documents were created to address the risk of harm created in supply chains and are written to complement the UN's guiding principles for business and human rights. The OECD guidance includes 6 components: embed policy and management systems, identify potential and actual harm, seize, prevent, or mitigate harm, track performance, communicate activities and progress, and enable remediation. Since the OECD guidance is very comprehensive, not all recommendations in the guidance are applicable to every supply chain actor. The YES standard is specific to implementing due diligence of spinning mills suppliers and accounting for all cotton lint received and processed. Because YES is focused on addressing forced labor risks in cotton production, the YES standard does not apply the OECD due diligence guidance to a spinner's own operations. The one exception to this is that YES will look at the operations relating to sourcing and managing cotton lint inside of the spinning mill. Liz will give you more information on the application of the due diligence framework after I tell you more about YES. RSN established YES to cultivate transparent and accountable supply chains and to encourage collaborative corporate engagement in the cotton sector. YES aims to prevent and mitigate the harm caused by the production of cotton using forced labor by conducting due diligence training and assessing yarn spinners for their ability to identify and address this harm. The YES mission is to create an industry-wide due diligence program for yarn spinning mills to eliminate cotton produced with forced labor from their supply chains. The YES standard and accompanying tools were created with the YES mission in mind. YES has a specific scope to stay focused on achieving the mission. What YES does is implements a high-risk-based due diligence approach, focuses on management systems and material control systems, applies a mass balance calculation of all cotton a spinner receives, processes, and produces as yarn or wastage, and encourage spinners to avoid cotton from high-risk origins that may have forced labor. To stay focused on the mission, there are activities that are not included in the YES initiative. YES does not identify and address labor conditions inside a spinning mill, create a check-the-box audit or code of conduct, certify yarn, or look at all human rights issues in cotton fields. We feel now is the right time for YES. New laws have been passed in recent years requiring enterprises, including brands and retailers, to identify and address forced labor in their supply chains. Most of the legislation that exists or is being introduced includes a reference to duty of care. This means that brands have to report on their due diligence actions to address any connection they have to any human rights harm, especially forced labor. YES is the only initiative that addresses forced labor in the production of conventional cotton. In addition to new legislation, there are several other reasons why brands and retailers are interested with the development and implementation of YES. There is concern about lawsuits against brands or that their shipments will be stopped from entering the United States. which is possible if their products can be linked to cotton from Turkmenistan. Anti-slavery legislation now requires companies to disclose their due diligence activities in California, UK, France, and most recently, Australia. Brands want to implement efforts related to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There's increasing collaboration by brands to address harm and improve environmental and social practices throughout their supply chains. And brands are starting to implement new transparency tools to engage more with workers and improve supply chain efficiencies, such as blockchain. The implementation of YES is designed to be applicable to the entire spinning industry, similar to how the Responsible Minerals Initiative coordinates all of their smelter audits for conflict minerals. Coordinating an annual YES assessment will be efficient, save audit costs, and assist brands and retailers in meeting their regulatory obligations. Cotton is processed through a complicated and fragmented supply chain, or as Liz likes to call it, a supply web, as depicted in this slide she created. Supply webs are not a linear chain. They are much more complicated than that. It is difficult to trace cotton lint through this complex supply web from raw material to final product. Rather than trace through the supply web, YES keeps the undesired products out of the supply web in the first place by implementing an assessment with the spinning mill, for reasons I will now explain. This is a simplified depiction of the supply chain, highlighting its three basic segments. Upstream, where the raw material is produced and often undergoes some initial processing to concentrate the desired content, such as removing the seeds from cotton lint at a ginner. Initial processors, such as a spinner, who mix and transform raw material into a product, such as cotton lint, into yarn. This stage, where the traceability of the raw material to country of origin or farm is often lost, this is often referred to as a choke point in the supply chain. And the downstream actors that manufacture, ship, and sell products to consumers. Spinning mills are the point the cotton supply chain where lint from various origins around the world is mixed with other sources and converted into yarn. After cotton becomes yarn or a textile, it is nearly impossible to know from where it originated. As a result, spinning mills are at a crucial choke point where cotton can still be identified as originating from a high or low risk country. Under YES, spinners would be trained on due diligence expectations and undergo an applicable due diligence assessment to mitigate the risk of forced labor in their cotton supply, essentially acting as a gatekeeper. Now I will turn it over to Liz, who will explain in more detail the application of due diligence with YES.
Thank you for the discussion of the YES standard's mission and intent. Before I begin my introduction to the YES standard, let's review some important terms we use throughout the standard and in this webinar. Due diligence, acting with reasonable care and investigating an issue before making a decision. I should note that due diligence is a constant process to identify, assess, and mitigate risks. It should be proactive, ongoing, and reactive. Risk, actual or potential exposure to harm, such as forced labor, of individuals or groups. Risk-based approach, applying different levels of due diligence proportionate to the risk faced by the enterprise. Red flag, a concern, discrepancy, or other suspicious activity in a spinner's supply chain. Examples include, but are not limited to, product or documentation references to a multi-country region rather than a country of origin, cotton that originated in a high-risk country, altered documents, or inconsistencies in paperwork. I would like to now provide more detail into what is expected to be conformant with the YES standard. Under the YES standard, a spinner is expected to implement an effective program and conduct due diligence of its suppliers and raw cotton lint or origin in a manner that is appropriate for the spinner's specific supply chain. The YES standard requires a spinner to implement due diligence proportional to the risk profile of its cotton lint sources. For example, a spinner that only sources from low-risk countries may have a simple program in place. Conversely, a spinner will be expected to conduct a higher level of due diligence for cotton lint that has originated in countries YES has determined belong in the high-risk category. Bear in mind that systems must be able to adjust to changes in sourcing practices. For example, a spinner may only source from low-risk regions currently. If a spinner expands its sourcing regions in the future, it will need to have a process to assess, identify, and, if applicable, mitigate risks that arise from these new sources. All spinners will need to establish management systems, evaluate risks based on supply chain information, and report on due diligence regardless of the source of their cotton. Steps related to the management of specific risks are only required for spinners sourcing from high-risk areas or by a spinner with a supply chain red flags, such as a supplier not providing transaction documents. If actual or potential risks of forced labor in the cotton lint production are discovered, a spinner will need to act to prevent or mitigate these risks. With this risk-based approach in mind, let's discuss the 6 areas of focus that each spinner is required to address in its due diligence program. First, establish a policy to guide the various responsible sourcing activities. A spinner is required to have a written policy that is publicly available. The policy content and intention should align with the goals of the YES standard and overall program, and it should be communicated to all suppliers. The policy must be supported by procedures and aligned across various departments in the enterprise, for example, procurement, receiving, and production. Lastly, a spinner must train relevant employees on the policy itself and the actions they must take in their daily operations to uphold the policy. 2, identify all the suppliers and cotton origins in the cotton supply chain and conduct due diligence of suppliers through a Know Your Supplier, or KYS, process. This process is the first step towards understanding where risks may exist in the supply chain. Mapping a supply chain involves understanding your suppliers, the cotton origins, and, in high-risk supply chains, all of the actors from farm to spinner. I will explain what level of due diligence is required for cotton that originated in high-risk versus low-risk countries in more detail after I introduce the remaining 4 steps of due diligence. Mapping the supply chain allows a spinner to understand better where to dedicate resources to investigate further, engage with stakeholders who may pose risks, or if the risks posed are significant enough, terminate relationships with high-risk suppliers. 3, implement a material management system that accounts for the flow of cotton from the receipt at the facility through processing and to the shipment of the final product. Once the lint is received, a spinner is expected to maintain control over its cotton inventory, including work in process, combing and carding wastage, and all forms of cotton lint. Received lint should be identified, weighed, documented into a system, reviewed against a spinner's procurement requirements, and assessed for origin plausibility and red flags. A spinner must be able to show how its material management system works and ensure that all material is accounted for by completing a mass balance calculation, that the total inputs, inventory, including the product and work in progress, on day 1 of, and all cotton received during an assessment period. This would be minus the outputs, inventory on the last day of, and all sales during that assessment period, and that these can be reconciled or match each other. Number 4 is identify, prevent, and mitigate risks that may exist in the supply chain. This process is critical for a due diligence program. Risks include discrepancies or inconsistencies in claims, documents, or expected lint characteristic of cotton grown in the claimed region. as well as whether the lint originated from a region that has known documented cases of forced labor, or high-risk country per the YES standard. A spinner will need to identify cotton lint sourced from high-risk countries and take appropriate measures to avoid purchasing cotton from high-risk sources at the gin or farm level, or work with others to mitigate the risks in the high-risk countries. 5 is undergo an annual third-party assessment. Currently, there is no YES assessment program, but we believe one will be available in the future. The goal would be to create an assessment that can serve the entire industry. Lastly, monitor performance and publicly report progress. A spinner is expected to review its current processes and procedures to ensure that the due diligence program has been implemented as intended and is effective. It is also expected to publicly report on its due diligence management program and progress made over time. I would like to circle back and explain 2 categories of supply chain risks: low and high risk supply chains. This is different from, but includes, the high and low risk countries in which cotton was produced. High risk supply chains could include lint produced in a high risk country, or there could be transaction or supplier risks. As shown in this slide, a supply chain must not meet any of the following conditions for it to be considered low risk. Cotton is produced in a high-risk country or is labeled originating from a multi-country region and not from a single country of origin, such as Commonwealth of Independent States or CIS. Material originates in a country with limited or no cotton production. There are discrepancies, inconsistencies, or other issues identified during the review of material, including lint characteristics and quality, and documentation that have not been addressed. If any of these situations is identified in a spinner supply chain, then those supply chains would be subject to the requirements of high-risk sourcing. If a spinner purchases cotton associated with a high-risk supply chain, additional due diligence must be done to ensure the cotton lint received poses low risk for forced labor during its production. A spinner is expected to fully understand the factual circumstances in its supply chain to be able to identify risks related to the responsible sourcing policy and assess whether or not these can be mitigated in order to continue to source from those areas. Ensure transaction documents can validate the plausibility of origin down to a farm or a gin that has been determined to be low risk for forced labor if the lint originated in a high-risk country. Develop a process around identifying, assessing, and managing risks. The additional due diligence requirements for high-risk sourcing scenarios can be thought of as in 3 steps. 1, map the factual circumstances of supply chain, including all actors, points of mixing, etc. 2, assess whether or not there are any risks associated with these circumstances. And 3, mitigate any risks that are identified. Although YES has not yet made a high risk or low risk determination for allowing or preventing forced labor for the Better Cotton Initiative, I would like to use Better Cotton as an example of how a spinner should conduct basic due diligence of a branded or other identified cotton scheme. When investigating Better Cotton, a spinner will need to know if the material in question is actual, physical Better Cotton or substituted Better Cotton, which can be conventional cotton from the same country in which the actual Better Cotton was produced. Questions a spinner might ask include, what assurance is there that the cotton was produced without forced labor if it is substituted Better Cotton and from a high-risk country? Have all of the originating Better Cotton farms been assessed to determine if forced labor exists or not? These questions delve deeper into the details within a high-risk country of origin and ensure due diligence is conducted on the supplier, or in this case, a third-party initiative's standard and system. I will now turn it back to Patricia to talk about the past, recent, and future activities of YES.
Thanks, Liz. The YES team has been extremely busy moving forward with a variety of YES activities. Before YES, RSN staff had worked on the issue of forced labor in the cotton supply chain starting at a meeting at Gap Inc. in San Francisco in 2008. In 2011, we created the Uzbek Cotton Pledge due to the government of Uzbekistan's practice of forcing citizens to work in the cotton fields. Over 290 brands and retailers have since signed the pledge and committed to not source cotton from Uzbekistan. After RSN issued the Cotton Sourcing Snapshot Report that I referred to earlier, we conducted a feasibility study with Made By, who interviewed various stakeholders from the cotton and apparel sectors around the world to determine if we should move forward with YES. RSN has engaged with numerous sustainable cotton initiatives, including becoming a member of SAC and Social Labor Convergence Project, giving input on the OECD due diligence guidance, and joining Better Cotton Initiative. In 2016, RSN launched the YES Initiative and received funding from Humanity United and the Walt Disney Company to research and draft the YES standard and assessment tools. And earlier this year, RSN created the Turkmen Cotton Pledge due to equally egregious exploitation of workers in the cotton fields of Turkmenistan and the imprisonment of journalists attempting to report on the government's activities. Focusing on the YES Initiative in the past 2 years, we have made a lot of headway. We established and convened a YES working group. In 2017, we hired consultant Liz Muller, and together we researched the cotton sourcing and internal management procedures of spinning mills in Turkey, Bangladesh, and India. Earlier this year, we drafted the YES standard and circulated it for public consultation, and we received over 200 comments, which we considered and incorporated into the standard where applicable. We prepared training webinars and assessment tools, and just this fall we conducted feasibility assessments of the revised draft standard and assessment tools at 5 spinning mills. Now I will give you a quick update on the feasibility assessments that we recently completed. In September and early October, Liz and I spent 3 weeks visiting spinning mills in Turkey, Bangladesh, and Uzbekistan and conducting feasibility assessments at each. Prior to our visits, we held a 2-part webinar training series that introduced the spinners to the YES Initiative, the YES Standard, Due Diligence, and accompanying workbook. If you are interested in these webinars, you can find them on RSN's videos and webinar web page. During the on-site feasibility assessments, Liz and I trained the spinning mills further by reviewing and answering questions about the webinars. We then did a spot check assessment of a sample of transactions and other documents pertaining to sourcing. Finally, we assessed their sourcing policies, know your supplier processes, and management systems. The results of this study were communicated to the spinners in the form of completed workbooks for each mill and lessons learned. We plan on integrating our learnings into a final draft of the YES standard and assessment tools by the end of this year. We will also create additional resources the spinners said would be helpful and asked us to provide. I'll now let Liz tell you about some of the lessons learned we discovered while doing the feasibility assessments.
Thanks, Patricia. We had a productive trip that revealed many lessons about the best ways to implement YES. Let's begin with YES standards requirement that are currently met by the industry. Some expectations outlined in the YES standard for a due diligence management system, such as validating the origin of cotton lint, material management systems, are already standard practices across the industry and will require little or no change to operations. For example, a country of origin certificate and phytosanitary permit must accompany all shipments of cotton exported from one country to another. Additional documents, such as a bill of lading, invoice, and description of cotton lint characteristics, accompany all transactions as an industry standard. The 8 spinners that participated in YES's 2017 research and 2018 feasibility assessments confirmed that this is that it is standard practice for all spinners to review the detailed information contained within the various transaction documents to validate the origin of cotton. Additionally, all spinners take appropriate care to weigh cotton lint upon receipt and account for all of that cotton lint as it is processed into yarn or captured as wastage or byproduct. Some requirements of the YES standard are not currently met, but could be incorporated into a spinner's operations with minimal changes. If industry standards are developed and widely adopted, these include developing a policy to avoid sourcing cotton that may have been produced with forced labor or communicating that policy to the public and to suppliers. Similarly, spinners currently conduct due diligence of suppliers through informal processes. The feedback we receive from spinners indicates that formalizing a know your supplier process, as required by the YES standard, would be achievable with minor adjustments to their existing supplier due diligence and procurement processes. During our recent trip, we were also reminded that there are challenges YES will have to help spinners overcome. Unlike many other commodity supply chains, spinners do not have leverage over many of their suppliers, namely the large global merchants that often supply imported cotton. Spinners suggest that RSN could discuss the goals and expectations of YES with global merchants to assess their willingness and ability to support the efforts of YES. Our conversations with spinners left us with some other considerations that we should bear in mind. We learned that spinners would find it helpful if YES created trainings, resources, and tools to help them understand and implement specific requirements of the YES standard. For example, spinners could use a checklist of what constitutes sufficient due diligence of suppliers, gins, farms in high-risk countries. Other helpful resources include a KYS questionnaire or sample letter to send to global merchants asking them to conduct due diligence of the gins or farms from which they source. Spinners feel that BCI has a good system using a mass balance approach that is easy for spinners to implement. The systems for organic and fair trade, which include segregating organic or fair trade cotton throughout the spinning process, are difficult for spinners to implement. We also discovered that spinners see an effort to align with BCI as beneficial and suggest that these efforts may lead to wider adoption of YES and growing support of BCI. Another suggestion for wider industry adoption is to simplify the YES standard and assessment workbook. Back to you, Patricia, to cover next steps.
By the end of January, we plan to have the YES standard and accompanying tools and training materials finalized and ready to introduce to the industry. We also plan to create a limited document library based on shipping and transaction documents we received during our research and feasibility assessments. We will measure the satisfaction of and receive feedback from all of the stakeholders that have contributed to the YES standard and tools. And lastly, we will have an updated business plan for YES to share with interested supporters. The following proposed activities are needed to develop and roll out a full YES program over the next 3 years. First, we plan to continue our research and develop program elements. We need to refine and expand program elements with guidance documents requested by the spinners, data collection tools, and KPI development. We will define auditor requirements, training, and an approval process. Create a full assessment process for the spinners, including initial engagement, corrective actions, approval, and future re-audits. We would like to conduct more detailed regional research with high-risk countries. Next, we need to complete comprehensive training materials and conduct training sessions for spinners and auditors. And then we need to conduct a full round of pilot assessments with trained auditors. We plan to formalize partnerships and collaborations. We need to determine the most appropriate way to coordinate our efforts and develop partnerships with existing apparel and cotton initiatives such as SAC, SLCP, BCI, CMIA, Cotton 2040, Textile Exchange, OECD's blockchain research, and others. We would like to undergo an alignment assessment against the OECD due diligence guidance, and we need to update our financial sustainability plan by mapping and forecasting annual corporate membership and other revenue streams and determining costs of spinner assessments and coordination. We plan on managing YES activities by expanding the YES team. We will transition our working group to a multi-stakeholder steering committee with guidance from the ICL Codes of Good Practice. We will create a YES membership that allows the industry to support and benefit from YES's efforts. And we need to expand our staff to coordinate trainings, audits, and research. We plan on implementing, revising, and integrating the YES initiative through rollout of YES assessments of spinning mills globally after the pilot phase, investigate integrating with an existing apparel or cotton initiative, and finally review and revise the YES standard and tools in year 3 if warranted. As you can see, we have a lot of ground to cover. Our goals are ambitious, but we firmly believe they are warranted, and the time for YES is upon us. We are actively asking brands, retailers, traders and merchants, investors, foundations, and others to contribute to the success of the YES initiative by becoming a founding partner. Founding partners will contribute to the YES initiative financially, sit on the YES steering committee, and for brands and retailers, you will have nominated spinning mills prioritized to undergo the YES assessments, both at the pilot phase and full assessments. NGO stakeholders are invited to sit on the YES steering committee, and once we get it up and running, likely in year 2, the YES audit committee. The results of becoming integrated and supporting YES will help enable compliance with the various legislation and sustainable development goals, incentivize the farmer-level initiatives, and support effective and transparent due diligence through the entire supply chain. Therefore, we invite you to support YES and be a leader in contributing to eradicating modern slavery from cotton production. Now I will turn it back to Maren to manage the Q&A portion of this webinar.
Thank you, Patricia. Since we are starting the Q&A portion, we will now stop recording the webinar. As mentioned earlier, to ask a question, please type it